And welcome back. Well, in light of the tragedies that have been going on around America over the past month, there's been a demand to address the issue, keeping millions of Americans convicted of felonies from serving on juries. In May of 2019, the New York State Senate passed a bill allowing felons who have completed their sentences to actually serve on juries. The bill was viewed as controversial and died in the assembly. Our next guest believes a fundamental way of dismantling systemic racism, which continues to plague society, includes allowing those with felony convictions to serve on criminal and civil trials. We'll be joined right now to provide their point of view on the matter. I'm joined by the founder of the Haicken Law Group, and Matthew Haicken, and Assistant Professor of Law, Criminology, and Criminal Justice at Cal State Long Beach University, James Binnall. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so, I mean, this is a conversation that's been going on for a minute now. We talk about where do actually those who've been convicted of felonies lie. Give us a little bit about this, because as we talk about moving things forward, I know that there is a way and there is some legislation that was on the table to try to bring this to come to pass, but give us a little bit about your perspective on where you see things.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'll start out. I kind of came to this sort of as an accidental advocate. I'm just a personal injury lawyer. I don't do criminal defense at all. I do car accidents, slip and falls, construction accidents, that sort of thing. And I met with Senator Brian Benjamin in the end of 2018, just in my capacity as an injury lawyer, and we spoke about certain things that are important to injury lawyers and our clients. It was a nice conversation. He's a great guy. He and I both went to the same college. And then the next day, I was looking at his website and I saw he was very interested in criminal justice reform. So I sent an email to somebody at his staff, and I just threw it out there and I said, hey, did you guys know felons can't serve on juries? I mean, that's something I heard personal injury lawyers talk about for years, and I can get into why it's important. But there was no response. And then about 7 months later, someone from his staff called me and said, hey, we forgot to tell you, the senator loves your idea. It's about to pass the Senate. So it was really exciting to me. Just go to one meeting, send an email, and then the bill passed the Senate. I said, can you name the bill after me? They said no. But said, that was really hoping for that. But they said it'll definitely pass the assembly and Cuomo will probably sign it. But then it became this third rail, and the Republicans and a couple of Democrats, they started having these press conferences, and they were saying things like, we're going to have serial killers on juries, terrorists, and it became this, it was just absurd. And the Democrats in the assembly, even though they really had the votes, they were, I don't know exactly what happened, but it seems like they were afraid of being called soft on crime. And Democrats in conservative areas in New York, they didn't want to touch it. So it just died in the assembly and everybody kind of forgot about it. And I was told that, look, it's just not going to happen. And then ever since George Floyd was killed, America has really changed. And I thought, now's the time to do it. So I've been knocking on doors. I had this op-ed published in Bloomberg Law. I just think it's such an important issue. It hasn't really been talked about that much. And I started Googling it, and the person I found who has really done the most research and really knows everything about it, has a book coming out about it, is Professor James Binnall. So I emailed him just out of the blue. He responded. We've been corresponding, and he can really talk about it from the criminal side, from an academic side. And he's got a really inspirational story. And it's frustrating to me that it hasn't really been talked about from the civil side, because when people are injured, the value of their injury is really supposed to be decided by a jury or their peers. And when you're excluding this whole segment of the population, they're really not getting fair compensation.
Yeah. Let me bring James in. And James, thank you so much for being with us and sharing. When we talk about this from, a civil side, from a criminal side, people will say this is illegal. This should not occur. And I know you spend a lot of time working and addressing this matter. So share with us your thoughts and how this affects you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me first. So it affects me in, first in a personal capacity. I am a person with a felony conviction. I spent a little over 4 years in 2 maximum security state prisons. when I was a younger guy. And interestingly, I got out and I went to law school, became an attorney in California. And I tell the story a lot as a way to contextualize this issue. I got called for jury duty. I believe it was 2009. And I showed up. I was a year in the bar. And I was told if I had checked the felony box on the juror questionnaire that I was no longer needed. Interestingly enough, I had sat second chair on a death penalty case in one of the courtrooms right up the hall from where we were doing jury selection about 3 weeks prior as an attorney. So in my mind, I was sort of okay enough to, work as an attorney in this very courthouse that was now expelling me from jury service because I had this criminal record. So I started looking into the issue starting then, really. And my first question was, why do we do this? My second question was, why haven't I heard about this before? And what I found was, arguably, we do this for two reasons, or at least these are the sort of suggested or proffered reasons we do this. One, because in the criminal context, that is, someone with a felony conviction is likely to acquit, right? In all instances, have sympathy for a criminal defendant. And then we also hear that people with felony convictions simply just don't have the character to serve, loosely defined, whatever that. Apparently, we have the character to serve as attorneys, but we don't have the character to serve as a juror, which sort of didn't make sense to me. And so I embarked on what's now been a decades-long research agenda to investigate empirically, do these rationales hold up? And what are the effects that this is having on our jury system? And what I found is that what others have found that have written, on this topic is that these statutes, first, they racially homogenize juries. I mean, there's no way around that. They disproportionately affect folks of color, right? Second is it may actually be harming our jury system. In the mock jury experiments that I've conducted, folks with felony convictions are actively engaged. They are thoughtful. They're well considered. And honestly, I mean, or actually, they apply the law even-handedly and they assess the facts in a very independent way. So we're losing this experience from our jury system and, arguably making our jury system worse because of it. On the civil rights side, this is, although it isn't a fundamental right, it is an important one. And folks with felony convictions ought to be able to serve as jurors. We hear a lot about voting these days, and we do every election cycle, but on the ground where arguably law happens, right, in courtrooms across the country, we're excluding at this point roughly 21 million Americans from a pretty important civic duty. So that's how I come to this issue. As Matt mentioned, I do have a book coming out. It'll be my first book. It'll be the only book really on the topic. It's called 20 Million Angry Men, the case for including convicted felons in our jury system. And I essentially lay out an empirical argument that suggests that this policy is ill-conceived.
And so we know that it's going to go legislatively the next time round. How do we see things proceeding going forward? I mean, certainly you can make an argument. I think that I've been in several arenas where it's a valid argument. And I think that when people have served their time, they've done their time, and they should be afforded the right to vote. And in a week when, we're celebrating the deaths of John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, great people who've been involved in social justice and also civil rights and voting rights, I think it's important for, America to really revisit this. But where do you see this going as far as going legislatively?
Well, I think in New York, everybody kind of forgot about it. It pretty much died in the spring of 2019. I spoke with Senator Benjamin. It was on a Zoom call. I think with a bunch of people. He's a great guy, and he just said, it's got to come from the Assembly this time. The Senate basically said the Senate's ready to go, but it's got to come from the Assembly. There's a Assembly member, Jeffrey and Aubrey, who proposed it, but it's kind of just stuck. And I just don't think that people are really, there just hasn't been that media push for it that there has been. We've gotten a lot of stuff done since the death of George Floyd. In New York, there was a change to the Civil Rights Law 50A. I mean, we're talking about stuff all over the country, taking down statutes. We fired Aunt Jemima. But this is something that's really would have a huge effect on millions of people across the country. and not just on the criminal side, but as far as injury cases in terms of compensation, making sure people get compensated fairly. So I think it's going to just take a lot of media exposure and really putting politicians' feet to the fire. And if we like in New York, if we could get the assembly to pass it and get it onto Governor Cuomo's desk, I think he would have a really hard time not signing this, because there would just be so much pressure, and he would have to really come up with an answer as to why people shouldn't be able to serve on juries if they have a felony conviction. And just to the one other point on that is, the Republicans and the few Democrats who, they talked about these criminals serving on our juries, and we'll have Son of Sam on a jury, and rapists and terrorists. The vast majority of people who have felony convictions these are crimes of poverty, drugs, petty larceny, this sort of thing. The most people with convictions are not violent murderers who you need to be afraid of. These are people who made a mistake often many years ago, and it just doesn't make sense. And I think if we get this out there, the way voting rights is out there in the public, the politicians would be forced to do the right thing.
Yeah, James, take off the counselor hat for a moment. Give me an opportunity to think about to share with our viewers. What did that feel like for you? I mean, here you are sitting co-counsel on a chair. You're sitting here and you're dealing with a death penalty murder case, and then you find out, like, when it comes to the jury, I can't serve. What did that make you feel like?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's pretty obvious, I think, right? It made me feel like a second-class citizen. It made me feel like what I did, what I had done, my penalty wasn't enough, that this was going to be a perpetual thing, that it was going to be forever, right? That I was going to have these certain things that were always going to remind me of the worst thing I had ever done in my life. I want to just add on to, you asked a little bit about legislation. I mean, I'm proud to say that California just passed the first more inclusive jury bill on this topic in 2 decades. So we passed SB 310 out here, took effect January 1st or January 2nd, 2020. And that bill restored voter eligibility to folks with felony convictions, with 2 exceptions, unless you were on active state supervision or unless you were a registered sex offender. So I'm glad that there is some topic that is put right up there with voting, and I think it deserves the same kind of attention. But to your earlier point, yes, it's stigmatizing, right? I'm good enough to be a lawyer, but I'm not good enough to be a juror. I didn't understand the logic at the time, and having done the research now, I still don't understand it. So.
Right. And given what's going on right now, obviously a lot of questions about with social unrest, looking at reforming the criminal justice system, looking at how we deal with police brutality, the repeal of 50A, as we talked about, a lot of traction being given in this area. Are people more receptive, if you will, during a time such as this, or are we still seeing this hard and fast wall when it comes to this particular issue?
I think I'll let James speak about California nationally. All I really know is New York. I think it just hasn't been tested. It passed in New York, as you know, last year, or sorry, 2018, the Senate flipped, we got Democratic control. And when Senator Benjamin ran with the idea, and God bless him, he put himself out there. He took a lot of flack. It passed the Senate, and then there was this huge backlash. It just hasn't been in the news, and it hasn't been proposed again. And I know that there's been a ton of other very important things that have been going on the civil rights side, and of course with COVID. So it's not like people have been sitting around doing nothing. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm sure everybody wants their bill front and center. But it just, I just don't think it's been tested in New York in this new world we're living in. And I think now if there were more stories about it, if the media got more involved, and thank you for allowing us to come on and talk about it. I think once people started realizing the fundamental change it could have on society when people with felony convictions were allowed to be on civil and criminal juries, I think it would start passing in state houses across the country.
Well, and you got to admit that, hear a story like James's story, who brings it out and really gives the
Absolutely.
full magnitude of, listen, here's a guy I'm convicted, but after being convicted, I've done my time, and yet and still I've turned around and served the system. I think a lot of people are like, wow, this really can, this really can work. But James, what was the moment for you that said, listen, after doing this, I wanted to get in law? Was it because you felt like the system was unjust during your process, or did you just say, listen, after being in for a minute, this is really what I have a passion for?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the choice to pursue law was not one of, initially, was not one of social justice or reform. It was simply making it, finding a career where I could make a living and support a family, and that's what I was looking to do. As I embarked on that and was a 1L and listening in criminal law class to them talk about those people, I started to realize that my background had value in this world and that I could make a difference, and that to not do so was, malpractice. And so I decided to pursue this road and this jury idea and this idea of not being able to serve on jury. I mean, it just sort of came up naturally. A lot of the things that I've written about have come up that way. I've written a little bit about parole and some other things. And so, while I was on it. So it was an interesting experience for me to move into this world as someone with a background. I wasn't sure how receptive the legal community would be. But I will say, I mean, I'm not the only one who has been in prison and who has a serious criminal conviction who's now an attorney. There are many of us across the country. And one last, I want to go back to the legislation for 1 second. I have to give due credit to Senator Nancy Skinner, who proposed SB 310 and ultimately got it through. And when we passed SB 310 in California, or when she did, I should say, I was a very small part of that, testifying on its behalf, given the research. We faced the same arguments that I read about in New York. I had District Attorneys Association say to us, well, we're going to need additional security at the courthouse if you're going to let all these felons come and serve. We had prosecutors say, well, what's going to happen if someone violates their probation or parole while they're sitting in the jury box, to say nothing of the alternates that are there anyway. So we faced the same thing. And I think in California, what won out was the science, right? We had several social scientists and people who study reintegration and reentry. They came to Sacramento and discussed that, look, this is an important issue, and it's an important issue in terms of reentry, and it's an important issue in how this affects the jury.
Yeah.
So my only hope is that in New York, that's sort of the road that they go down.
Certainly, there's some things that can work out for the better. James, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your story, and for also the great work that you're doing in California. Matthew, thank you so much for sharing with us here in New York. And as we see that legislation go forward, hopefully we'll be able to get it across the desk and see the same kind of things that's happening on the West Coast right here on the East Coast. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're taking a quick break here on the Social Justice Show. As you saw, we went from the East Coast to the West Coast. We're going to bring it back a little bit more local right after this when we return here in a moment.